Eu estou aqui com o David Friedman.
I wanted to start by saying that I too have homeschooled my children. Not Patri. He was brought up by his mother. And I would like to invite the previous speaker to solve his problems by moving to California. More or less by accident, California has effectively unregulated homeschooling. If you want to homeschool, you fill out a form announcing that your home is a school. You are supposed to keep various records, none of which anybody will ever ask to see, and you then proceed. But that wasn't what I wanted to talk about tonight. There are always problems in translation, as all of you know, and when I read the schedule for this event, it was not clear to me that people would correctly deduce from the Portuguese title what the English title of my talk had been. So I thought I would give that to you first. The title of my talk is Anarchy and Efficient Law. And that is also the title of a book chapter I wrote many years ago. And I want to start with a problem. And it is a problem that I think most libertarians, all free market conservatives, all classical liberals face. And the problem is that all of these groups believe that governments are very bad at doing things. That if you have the government produce cars, your cars will be expensive and will break down. If you have government produce food, it will be expensive and you may be hungry. And the conclusion that all of these people reach is that the solution is to have a legal regime in which production is private, in which agriculture and cars, and for the more radical people, even schooling, is produced privately by individuals by voluntary association. And this clearly sounds like a very attractive idea. And then you think a little longer, and so the solution is that the government, which is incompetent to produce things, will produce a legal regime in which things are done in this fashion. And that sounds a little less plausible because, as those who have actually studied law realize, law is not a simple problem. That with the best will in the world, there are a great many very complicated issues in figuring out what the law ought to be. I think constructing a legal system is probably even harder than designing an automobile. And if the government cannot design automobiles, why do you think it can design a decent legal system? And of course, with regard to the legal system, as with regard to the automobiles, there are really two problems. The first is a problem of competence, and the second is a problem of incentives. That is to say, one reason, if I take a much more modest example, one reason why the main effect of the interventions of the U.S. government in U.S. agriculture has for 70 years been to make food more expensive is that what the government is trying to do is not to make food less expensive, but to make farmers richer. That is to say, farm program in the U.S., as in many but not all other countries, is essentially a program to buy the votes of the farm states by enriching farmers at the expense of city people. And for reasons, some of which my son suggested in his earlier talk, it often is politically profitable to benefit relatively concentrated interest groups at the expense of dispersed interest groups, and this is one more example. Similarly, one would expect that a government that was designing a legal system not only would not be competent to do so, it would have no particular reason to develop a good legal system. That they would like to develop a legal system that serves a range of political objectives. Some of them might be desirable, some undesirable, but actually making a system that makes people richer or freer is not very high up in that list of priorities. And there's no particular reason why it should be. Political actors, politicians, and voters, and judges, all of the people in the system, including all of us, each is a rational individual pursuing his own ends, just as in the marketplace. And in the political system, unlike the marketplace, there's no reason in general to expect that process to produce attractive results. If people are interested in a more general discussion of that issue, I gave a talk not long ago, which you can find linked to my webpage, on what economists call market failure, which is basically situations where individual rationality does not lead to group rationality. And I offered reasons, some of which my son has just suggested, why in the political system market failure is the norm. If you think of the political system as a marketplace, it's a marketplace in which we cannot expect individual rationality to produce group rational results. If that's the case, then we have an obvious problem. How could you set up a set of human institutions which would generate good law? If you think of the problem as under what circumstances will it be in the individual interests of the people making the law to do it right, how would you do that? And for people who believe in free markets, your first sort of guess is to say, well, we obviously need some kind of a market production of law. And that sounds like a somewhat odd idea because we're used to law as something that's made and enforced by the state. In fact, there are examples of market-produced law. As you may know, a lot of commercial legal disputes are handled by private arbitration. Arbitrators have legal rules they act according to. Since in order for arbitrators to get business, they have to offer legal rules that companies want to be under for disputes between companies, the arbitrators have an incentive to try to generate, in some sense, well-designed legal rules. And the question is, could you do anything like that in a broader and more general sense? Could you set up a set of social institutions where the same sorts of forces that give us good cars and good cell phones and good food would also give us good law? And I believe that I proposed 30-some years ago a solution to that problem, and that's the solution I want to discuss and to try to explain, first, how the society I imagine would function. Second, why it would tend to produce economically efficient law. And third, why it would only tend to. Why, as in most market situations, the result will not be perfect. There will be certain predictable ways in which even the best institutions I can think of will get things wrong. And the argument for them is only they will get them less wrong than any other alternative that I know of. So let me start by sketching out what I think of as a hypothetical set of institutions for an orderly private property market society with no government. And so the basic problem is, how do you enforce rights? How do you make sure that contracts are kept, that people don't rob from each other, kill each other, and so forth? And I want to start out with the easiest problem. And I'm going to try to show you that there is one subset of that problem which more or less solves itself, and then try to convince you that I can leverage that subset into doing the whole job. And the subset of the problem is the problem of enforcing contracts between people who are interacting with each other for a long period of time. If you think about two people who are engaged in a joint project, or two firms that will expect to be dealing with each other for the next 20 years. In that situation, you can enforce contracts pretty well without any enforcement mechanism, because I know that if I cheat you this year, you will refuse to do business with me next year. All right? That's what is sometimes referred to as the discipline of constant dealing, that you have an automatic enforcement system for human beings if you are having repeat dealings with somebody, and they can stop dealing with you if you break your word, cheat, and so forth. Right? Now let's see how we can solve the much harder problem of how do I enforce my rights against a mugger who has no particular desire to do business with me, how I can enforce a contract that I only have once with somebody where there's no repeat dealing, and so forth. So I want to imagine a society where the enforcement of rights is a private industry. We have private firms, hopefully quite a lot of private firms, and they have customers. And I pay my private rights enforcement firm some annual fee in exchange for which they agree that they will protect me from murder and robbery, will arrange that my contracts be enforced, will arrange that my disputes with other people are peacefully settled, and so forth. So to start with, we imagine a society like Brazil or America where there are a bunch of firms of this sort and where almost everybody is a customer of one such firm. And the problem with this system is obvious to everybody. You have no idea how many times I have been told why this couldn't possibly work. And the problem is what happens when my television set vanishes from my living room, and my rights enforcement agency, being a high-tech agency, has installed a camera in my living room in advance, which took a picture of my friend here walking out the door with my television. And so my agency, having identified the picture, sends a polite gentleman to him, asking for my television back, and asking him to also pay them an extra $100 for their time and trouble in retrieving it. And he replies that he has never seen me before, that he got this television from an old friend 6 months ago, and that they should go about their business. And so my agency explains to him that unless he can show them reasons to think that he did not steal my television, they will be showing up at his door tomorrow with 3 strong men to retrieve the television. And he responds, but I too have a rights enforcement agency. And if you come with your 3 goons and try to take my television away, my agency will come with 5 goons and protect me. And you then have the beginning of a war, and that is why many people from Ayn Rand on down have argued that such a system could not possibly work. But I think that's the wrong story. That's not what really happens. And the reason that it isn't what really happens is that wars are very expensive, and private firms wish to minimize their costs. And so my agency says to itself, if we try to send 6 goons against his 5 goons, someone will get hurt, the television may get broken, we're going to have to start paying hazard pay to our employees. This does not look good for the bottom line. Let's call up his agency and discuss the problem. And both agencies realize that violent conflict is expensive and risky, and that the sensible thing to do is to find some neutral arbitrator who will decide who the television set belongs to. And since they can see that this problem will occur again and again in the future, the sensible thing to do is to pre-commit. That my agency makes an agreement with his agency, which says when such disputes occur, we will go to the private arbitrator over there, who has a good reputation, is a competent sort of private judge, and we will accept his verdict. And if he says that our customer is in the wrong, we won't protect our customer. And we'll make it clear to our customers that we do not protect them when they steal television sets. If they say that our customer is in the right, then your agency agrees that if our customer was accused, you will apologize and make him some compensation. And if our customer was the victim, you will turn over your customer to be punished or make him pay reimbursement. So the basic argument is that we solve this problem by a network of private contracts in which each pair of agencies agrees on a private arbitrator to settle disputes. But now you say, wait a minute, this is a world with no government. So who enforces those private contracts? But that problem we have already solved. Because as I started out by saying, the one kind of enforcement of contracts that does not require the government is the enforcement of contracts between firms that expect to be dealing with each other for a long time. And my agency and his agency are such a pair of firms. So that if the next time there is a dispute, my agency goes to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator says, he didn't steal the television set, you made a mistake. If my agency says, we don't care, we're going to take the television set, then his agency will refuse to abide by arbitration in the future, and they'll have to fight each other all the time, and their costs will be very high, and they will gradually lose their customers to other agencies that have more sensible and honest and honorable policies and are willing to keep their contracts with each other for arbitration. All right? So that's the basic framework sort of a simple model of an anarcho-capitalist society. And as with any picture of a real human institution, it's obviously very much simplified. If you really had it working, you would see a lot more complication than I'm describing. As it happens, there is quite a good science fiction writer, Werner Vinge, who has a short story somewhere which describes a conflict between a state and an adjacent area run in the way I described. And it was really fascinating to me, because since he's a fiction writer, not an economist, he sort of put put life into it. He showed what the things would look like, how people would feel about them, sort of the whole network of emotions and commitments and feelings that real institutions have. And at the end of the story, he referred to my book as the source for the ideas. And I sort of like when people steal my ideas. When you're young, you worry about people stealing your ideas. When you're old, you worry about people not stealing your ideas. And I reciprocated by stealing some of Vinge's ideas for other purposes. In any case, so I've described roughly what the system is like, but the reason that I brought it up in this talk is that I want to argue that it provides a solution to my problem. That is, that this is a set of institutions which will tend to generate good law for about the same reason, not exactly the same reason, but about the same reason that private markets build good cars. And let me take a brief and slightly technical digression, because good law is a pretty vague term. And among libertarians, there are a variety of ideas about what good law would be like, many of them based on a mistaken idea of how easy the question is. But I want to take a very simple economist's view. And what I mean by good law at the moment for this talk for the next 45 minutes is economically efficient law. And what does that mean? Imagine some change in a society, and I don't care what it is, which affects lots of people in different ways. And you could imagine finding out for each person, if he's in favor of the change, what's the most he'd pay to get it, and if he's against the change, what's the most he'd pay to stop it. And there is some economic sense in which the most somebody would pay to get something is the value of that something to him, and the most he would pay to avoid something is the disvalue of that something. And you can then imagine summing all those numbers. And if the sum is positive, if the benefit to the people who benefit as measured by what they individually would pay to get that benefit is larger than the summed cost to those who lose, we call it an economic improvement. And if it's negative, we call it an economic worsening. I don't want to argue this is the only thing anybody should care about. But I do want to argue that it's a very useful sort of summary measure of the effects of changes. And that on the whole, everything else being equal, changes that produce net benefits on average benefit people, though any change is going to hurt some people and help some people. And on average, changes that produce net costs on average hurt people. And I should say, for the economists in the audience, I'm really borrowing this approach to the problem of evaluating things from Alfred Marshall, who was the economist who more or less put together modern economics about 100 years ago. And for any economists in the audience, I am not following Pareto's approach, which I regard as a way of evading the problem rather than solving the problem. If people are curious, we can discuss that later, but those are two technical issues, I think, for this audience. But basically, what I'm going to argue is that the institutions I've described will tend to modify the law in ways that produce net benefit for the people who it affects. So imagine, think about it from the standpoint of an arbitration agency, a private court. In order for the private court to make money, people have to choose to use it. It has got to get pairs of agencies to agree on what court they will use. And part of the product the private court is selling is its legal system. Notice that this is not a society where everyone is under the same law. That's one of the things that seems weird about it. The law between him and me is determined by the agreement of his agency and my agency. The law between him and me is determined by the agreement between his agency and my agency. The law between the two of them is determined by the agreement between their two agencies. So it is a polylegal system, a system in which not everyone has identical law. There will be some pressure towards standardization, as in other markets, because it's easier to do business if people have about the same rules. But there will also be some pressure towards diversity, because different customers want different things. There may be some customers who are Orthodox Jews who would like a legal system that has various provisions designed to make it work better for Orthodox Jews. There may be some who are seriously believing Muslims. There may even, believe it or not, be some who are libertarians. You're going to have a diverse market of people who are, in effect, indirectly buying law through their enforcement agencies, and therefore you would expect some diversity in the products that market produces. All right, what will the law look like? Suppose there is, just think about the agency that wants our business being the business of the rights enforcement agencies that we patronize. If it can think of a way of changing its law code that the customers of both agencies like, it has a clear incentive to do that, because that will make it better able to secure their business. Suppose it has a way of changing the law code that his customers like and my customers don't like. But suppose it's important to his customers and not very important to mine. So that if you could somehow do the market research, the court would conclude that his customers would pay an extra $10 million a year to get the legal rule changed in that way, and mine would only pay $1 million a year to stop it. Well, it's perfectly simple. My agency and his agency agree with the court to change the rule, and his agency pays my agency $2 million a year. So my agency won't be able to charge as much to its customers because it's producing a slightly less attractive product for them. Not quite the law they wanted, but it can cut its rates so they'll stay its customers. His agency is now producing a still more attractive product for their customers, so it can afford to raise its rates and keep customers. So if you generalize this argument, you can see that the sort of built-in dynamic of the system is going to tend to make shifts if those shifts produce net benefits. If the shift benefits the people who are affected by it more than it hurts it, there is some combination of the shift plus a side payment which you can get everybody happy with, and then using that combination, the private court will be more popular with its customers and therefore will be able to make more money for its services. All right? So that's the guts of the argument. That's the basic argument. And let me point out first why this works in a way in which government doesn't work, and second, why it does not work perfectly, which for an economist is often the most interesting question. So to begin with, your response might be, but this does no good, because although you and I know that libertarian laws are the best laws, most people don't, and therefore most people will choose to buy bad law. They'll choose, just as they choose to vote for bad law at present, they'll buy bad law in this case. And I want to point out that there are two very large differences between buying things and voting for them. The first is that when you vote for something, your voting for it has essentially no effect on your getting it. All right? I live in a country with 300 million people. You live, most of you, in a country with 200 million people. The chance that who I vote for president will determine who is president is somewhere vaguely around 1 in 10 million. It is not worth making any serious effort to figure out who I should vote for when I know that getting the right answer changes the odds by 1 in 10 million. Therefore, almost all voters are, in the language of economists, rationally ignorant. That is to say, it is rational to be ignorant when the information is worth less than it costs. And information about what government ought to be doing is almost invariably worth less than it costs, unless you're the member of a special interest group which can expect to get a very large benefit out of what government is doing. So for the ordinary voter, the same voter who, before he buys a car, will read consumer reports in the auto magazines and test drive 2 or 3 different cars and chat with his friends to see which one is happy with his car, will decide who to vote for according to whether he looks handsome or whether he has a really good-sounding 8-word slogan, or whether his friends will think well of him for voting for that person, not on the basis of any reasonable evaluation of the program of the candidate. When I'm discussing this question with students in America, I sometimes put the question to them, do you know the name of your congressional representative? And about half of them do, and about half of them don't. And I can't really put them down because I don't either. The point being that, first, there is no very good reason except curiosity, or if politics is the game you like, to know the name of your representative. because even if you go to all the trouble of reading the news and finding out what he's voting for and seeing if you like it, you still can't get him elected or unelected because you're one voter out of many, unless you have a lot of money or a lot of influence and what he's doing is helping you a lot, and then you can spend enough to affect things. So therefore, in the public market, as it were, in the voting market, voters are rationally ignorant. In the private market, on the other hand, if I decide which car to get, I get it. So if I make a bad decision, I end up with a car that breaks down and costs me a lot of money. If I make a good decision, I end up with a good car that lasts a long time. And that means that the same person who will rationally vote on no information at all on an unimportant question like who is president of Brazil will rationally try to do a good job of getting well informed on the question of what car he's going to buy. So that's one difference, because notice that in my system, law is now a private good and not a public good. Because after all, if I decide that the arbitrator who our two firms have chosen is really no good, that the legal rules that he imposes are bad, evil, wicked legal rules, and furthermore, he takes bribes. If I decide those things, what's the next thing I do? I say, I don't like my enforcement agency anymore. They're the ones who chose that guy for me. I'm going to find another enforcement agency, maybe the one my neighbor uses, which has found a thoroughly honest man over next to him who does a good job of being a judge, and I'll switch to them instead. So in the system where law is a private good being produced on a market, there is a much stronger reason for the individuals whose decisions drive the system to make those as well-informed decisions, because to some degree, what you choose you get. I say to some degree. Remember, it does no good for my agency to be in favor of him as a judge unless they can persuade his agency to agree. So that what we're having is a situation where, as it were, the people bargaining on my side are trying to give me what I want, and it therefore pays me to decide what I want. To some degree, I get to choose, but not without limit. There isn't going to be any agency who has a judge who always rules in my favor, because no other rights enforcement agency would agree to that judge. So there is an element of compromise, but it's an element in which my preferences have heavy weight on me, not on him. When I switch agencies, he's still with the same agency. The second point is related to that, and that is that even if voters were willing to go to the trouble of trying to figure out who to vote for, it is very hard to get the necessary information. Because, let me take for a moment the present situation in the U.S. During the election, my expressed opinion was that Obama was probably the least bad of the three major candidates, those being 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. My guess now is that I was wrong. My guess is that, in fact, he was worse than one or both of the other candidates. But I'll never know, because I don't get the opportunity of seeing what McCain's administration would have been like. It's entirely possible. After all, Bush was a Republican. Bush was nominally in favor of good things and low government spending. And what did he do? He vastly expanded government spending. Judged by Bush's principles, Bush was a much worse president than Clinton, because Bush actually did the opposite of what he said, and Clinton didn't come too far from doing what Bush said. You know, balanced budget, right? We had a balanced budget for a while. So I don't get to see what kind of a president McCain would have made. So I never get the information, even if I was willing to try to get it, that I really need to make an informed choice. Each administration is facing a new set of problems. It's dealing with them. Something happens. Well, maybe if we hadn't elected Bush, we wouldn't have gone into Iraq. And maybe if we hadn't gone into Iraq, the world would be a better place. Maybe not. I don't know. On the other hand, if I want to buy a car, I get to drive one car, drive another car, talk to my neighbor's car. I get to compare products. Well, let's think about what I get to do when I'm hiring a rights enforcement agency, part of whose product is the network of contracts setting up the law that I'll be under. Well, I can say, I've been under this rights enforcement agency, and it did a lousy job of enforcing my contracts. And furthermore, some SOB sued me for something I hadn't done, and I ended up losing and paying money. But my neighbor, why, he's got a rights enforcement agency that really protects him. When somebody robbed him, in 2 days they had the stuff back. When somebody sued him and he was in the right, the court threw the case out. When somebody sued him and he was in the wrong, he lost. But that's what happens when you're in the wrong. That is to say, if the law is being produced on a private market, you have the opportunity to see what different firms are producing, to some degree at least to compare the quality of their products, how much they charge for it, and thus you have not a perfect mechanism. There are no perfect human mechanisms, but you are at least closer to being able to make the kind of informed judgments we normally make in private markets. And you therefore are much closer to having the kind of institutions for generating good law that we currently use for generating good cars and good food. Now, I noticed a while ago that this meeting is conforming to proper libertarian disorganizational rules and was running about an hour behind. And I have at this point lost track of when I'm supposed to stop speaking. So could someone please tell me, assuming that I want 10 or 15 minutes for questions, how much longer am I supposed to be talking? Another 10 minutes. Very good. Thank you. In that case, let me discuss briefly, because I think it's of interest, especially to an economist, the ways in which this will not give us exactly the right law. And there are at least 3 different issues here. For a longer discussion, if you go to my webpage and search around, you can find the chapter on anarchy and efficient law, which discusses these matters in more detail. And the first problem is that the rights enforcement agencies, like some other firms, are only going to care about marginal customers. All right? Let me consider for a moment the same problem in an industry that already exists. As you can observe, I use an Apple computer, a Macintosh. I have used Macintosh computers for as long as there have been Macintosh computers to use. If Apple raises its prices by $200, I am not going to switch to Windows. If Apple lowers this, if Apple removes some feature I like, I'm not going to, unless it's a really big feature, I'm not going to switch to Windows. That means that Apple can ignore me in designing their computers. That what Apple wants to focus on are those customers who are marginal, are those customers who are just about on the edge between Mac and Windows or Mac and Linux, and who therefore it might either draw in by making a product they like a little better or drive out by making a product they like a little worse. So therefore, when I talk about, going back to my system, when I talk about designing laws people like, if my agency currently has a set of laws that I really love, making them a little better won't get them a penny. They can't charge me more because they don't know that I'm the guy who really loves those laws. And if they raise their whole price, they'll drive out the people who are marginal, which I'm not. All right? So that means that what they're really doing is not quite trying to make the laws that maximize total benefit to everybody. That would be the economically ideal result. They're doing it watching those customers who are close to the edge between hiring their firm and hiring some other firm. So in that respect, it's going to approximate moving to a fully efficient legal system, but it's not going to get there all the way. Same thing is true about Apple. This is not a special feature of the market for law. It is a feature of certain kinds of markets where you have a small number of firms producing products with differing characteristics, and some people value some characteristics more than others. For the economists in the audience, I'm really talking about what's called the theory of monopolistic competition, which is the kind of competition where rather than having a lot of firms like the wheat market producing identical products, you've got a number of firms producing products that compete with each other but not perfectly, like Apple and Windows machines and Linux machines. All right? Second problem. The second problem is that when his agency and my agency are agreeing on a legal rule, they only care about effects on their customers. Let me take a real example, and which is one where I can not only predict that my system will get it wrong, I can tell you in which direction it'll get it wrong. Because one of the things that we are going to disagree about is copyright law. I am an author, And I, therefore, want a judge who believes in copyright law. Nice, strong copyright law, so that I can get revenue from my writing. He, we will imagine, is a consumer of intellectual property. He reads books. And he, on the whole, is not too happy about having to pay me licensing fees to read my books. Now, if it was just the two of us who were affected, the agency would, in effect, say, is it worth more to me to have copyright law or more to him not to have copyright law? And they'd try to get the law that way. And if only the two of us were affected, that would be the right answer. And then what we would say is, look, it's true that when he pays me licensing fees, he loses money, but I get that money. Furthermore, if nobody pays me licensing fees, I won't write the book, and then he won't get the benefit of reading the book, so on net, we're better off with copyright law. Maybe, maybe not, because there are costs to enforcing laws. But in fact, if our agencies agree to copyright law, not only does he pay me licensing fees for my books, that makes me write more books, and you get to read those books even though your agency has not agreed to copyright law. All right? There is what economists call an external benefit, because by his agreeing, in effect, he's agreeing to be bound by copyright law, indirectly through his firm. By his agreeing to that, he is giving me an incentive to write more. And my writing more is producing a benefit to other readers, including readers whose agencies did not agree to copyright law. So that means that the private market for law I have described will produce a less than optimal level of protection for intellectual property. I don't know what the optimal level is. It could be the optimal level is 0, in which case it doesn't matter. But just in terms of the pure economics of it, because all of the benefit of protection goes to me as the guy who's protected. Sorry, I'm wrong. All of the cost of protection goes to him as the guy who's got to pay me the fees. Some of the benefit goes to me, and some of it goes to all those people who aren't in this negotiation, because they've got different enforcement agencies. Consequently, the part of the benefit will get left out of the calculation, and therefore you might fail to get copyright law even if benefits were larger than costs. It's a little technical, but at least to me it's interesting to see what are the imperfections of what seems to me to be the best system I can describe. Let me make a further point, though, which again should be of interest especially to economists, but not only to economists. And that is that the market that I'm describing is really quite a weird market. Because at first glance you say it's a competitive market. Look, there are 300 million people out there, all of whom are in effect bargaining through their agents for legal rules. But it isn't really a competitive market. It's really 300 million monopolies. Because you see, what I want to buy from him, I, thinking myself as one person in this market operating through middlemen, is his agreement to legal rules. He's the only person in the world who can sell his agreement to legal rules. I can't buy 2 agreements from you and use one of them for him. So in effect, what we have is a monopoly bargaining in which I am bargaining with everyone in the world on what rules I will agree to. He's bargaining with everyone in the world on what rules he will agree to. And of course, just as the real economy doesn't consist of individual producers and consumers dealing with each other, we have middlemen. So in this one, my agency is representing me and 50,000 other people in its part of the bargaining, and his similarly. So we are going to have, as I've argued, forces that are move us towards efficient rules, but if you try to think of it as an economic problem, it's a mistake to imagine that it's the wheat market. It isn't the wheat market. It's something much stranger. It's a market of a whole lot of monopolies engaging in bargaining. And as some of you may know, although economists don't like monopoly markets as much as competitive markets, with perfect bargaining, even monopoly markets give you efficient outcomes. That's one of the implications of what's called the Coase theorem. So that, again, for the economists out there, the argument I'm making really relies more on Coase than on Marshall, even though I'm getting what sounds like a Marshallian result of an efficient outcome. All right, I think that's basically what I wanted to say. I assume that some of you will want to talk about other issues associated with what I'm describing, but what I really wanted to focus on, partly because some of you are already familiar with the idea of anarcho-capitalism, is looking at anarcho-capitalism not as a more or less just system, but simply as a set of institutions in which it is the private interest of the people making the laws to do it right. for the same kinds of reasons, loosely speaking, that it's in the private interest of restaurants to make good food, in the private interest of farmers to do a good job of farming, and so on. That's the argument I'm sketching. Questions?